recording. Okay, I hope recording has started. I no longer get the message for some reason. Right, so we will crack on. This morning is going to be a treat, and I know because I heard this presentation on Tuesday at the History of Internal Communication Management Conference. And Michael will tell us all about why it is that the the research that's been done into the history of internal comms is so significant for us as a profession overall. So particularly because you're going to need to leave us a couple of minutes early, Michael, I'm going to stop yabbering and allow you to introduce both yourself and the session that you're going to be running for us.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here today on this wonderful degree, this master's degree, which Liz gave a brilliant presentation on Tuesday as well, the history of the of the
Thank you.
master's degree. So yeah, so my name's Michael Heller, Professor Michael Heller. I'm from Northumbria University, where I'm a professor in business history. Um, Although it's a bizarre background. I mean, I'm a historian. I've got 4 degrees in history from Cambridge, UCL, classically trained historian, um, in a business school, because there is no work in history departments, and business schools, particularly then. I got my PhD in 2004, and business schools then were booming in the UK. There was just all these overseas students coming over, particularly from China, but no, I mean everywhere, Middle East, India, everywhere, Africa, and Europe. Lots of European students at that time because we were in the EU, so European students were paying the same as British rates. I mean, leaving Europe damaged us in so many ways, and universities were one way. We lost a lot of very, very, very good students, unfortunately, as a result of that. And so I ended up in the business school, and I actually taught, and I still do. I teach marketing. I mean, up until 2 years ago, I was a senior lecturer, reader in marketing. I was the head of marketing at, at Brunel Business School, but then I got my chair now, business history, and I do research, and I suppose my main areas work. It's really my PhD was on the history of clerical workers of office work in London, from 1880 to 1914. And I think that's been a big theme through. So, for me, looking at internal comms again is looking at work. It's just a new form of professional work, but it's about work. It's about communication. And when actually it was actually when I was doing my research on clerks, on clerical workers, office workers, that every time I went to an archive, I'd go into Royal Bank of Scotland, I'd go into Shell and Prudential. They'd always give me a company magazine and say, "Well, look at these magazines. That's where you'll find stuff." And it's actually true because what's interesting is, um, if you actually look at the earliest forms of internal comms, which is fascinating, they were actually written by employees. They weren't written by management. They were employee. Today, what's the word all these sexy words we use: co-production, co-creation, and so forth. And if you actually look at the early magazines, they were actually created by employees. They organically. There's actually a really interesting comparison with intranets. Yeah, if you actually look at when intranets first started appearing all around the world, in corporations, in the late, particularly when they hadn't been fully institutionalized, they were still new tech which were floating around. A lot of the first intranets were not introduced by companies; they were introduced by people in companies that started bringing them in and setting them up. It was only later that companies actually said, right, we need to take control of these platforms, and that was exactly the same with company magazines, which was the first form of internal comms. So, I mean, I think that's interesting. One thing that we've picked up on in the research, actually, I mean, and you always get that with history, which makes it so interesting, is tensions, conflicts. between, you'll just see that going on everywhere. And uh, there has been a conflict throughout the 140 years history of internal comms of who controls that comms. Yeah. Internal comms is meant to be internally for employees. So who gets to control it? Is it the employees? Is it their unions or associations? Is it management? Is it shareholders? So that again, I think is quite an interesting theme that goes through. But anyway, so I started looking at magazines, and then eventually I realized, well, actually, this is what I want to study. So to begin with, I used an object as something that helped me research something else. But I think after a while, I thought, no, these will be the subject of my research. I'll look at them, and yeah, I've been researching and publishing on this since I think 2008. We got a small grant in 2012 for about £10,000 for 2 years to look at the history of magazines, company magazines from 1945 to the present. And then it was when I was doing that research, and we went into so it was just again, it was just magazines. That's all we were looking at. And then I was researching in the post office archives, and that's important because the post office is huge. I mean, in the 1960s, they employed, nearly 400,000 people. It was one of the biggest organizations in the world at the time. Um, um, and when we were looking in the post office, we came across this incredible document called the Internal Communication Study Group, which was set up in 1972. And you know when something's important from the past because if it leaves behind a lot of stuff, that's important for two reasons. It means A, it's produced a lot of stuff in the past, but B, and far more important, its material has been preserved. Most stuff that gets produced, just think about all the stuff you produce on a daily basis, right? On a weekly, how much of that is actually going to survive for the next 50, 60, 100 years? Huh? That's an interesting question. Where most of what you produce is ephemera. It gets produced, it gets used, it gets archived, and then it disappears. So when we go into archives and we find lots of stuff still available, that tells us that there's something important about this for it to be preserved. That's a very important principle in research. And what we found were just boxes of these files on this research group. And that's when I thought, hang on, what's this word, internal communication? I mean, we've come across it, obviously, but what, and I'm going to talk about this in this presentation, what was dawning on me when we were doing this was that what had happened in the 60s was that this had it it come into fruition. It had been given birth. That the before this there is no internal comms. I mean, this is very important to understand, right? Where does your profession come from? When do people start saying, I am an internal comms professional, and organizations have internal comms managers, and you have internal comms reports, and you have internal comms campaigns? And it was in the 60s and 70s that happened. So before that, you had this other thing. Now there's no word for it, but we call it editorial internal communication because it's written, it's edited. So it's basically things like company magazines and circulars and memos and so forth. But it's the magazines which are driving this, and it's written and it's one way and it's top down. And then suddenly in the 60s and 70s, that method of communication was no longer seen to be appropriate. And a new practice, a new profession um, came into existence, and that was called internal communication. And that is fascinating because we've seen this happen with other disciplines. When does marketing appear? When do you suddenly get marketing professionals and marketing strategies and, you know, uh, marketing executives? And again, it's not really until after the Second World War. I mean, I've done lots of research on marketing and branding and so forth. I published a paper last year on the marketing of gas, the publicity of gas in the 20s and 30s. And, we did a lot of research going into archives, reading, publications from the gas industry. I don't think we ever once saw the word marketing. Never once saw that word used. Yeah. We saw words like advertising and publicity. We even saw the word propaganda. You saw that a lot, gas propaganda in the Northeast, gas propaganda in Newcastle at Christmas. But you never saw the word marketing. Yeah. So again, absolutely fascinating question. When do professions, when do practices, when do they come into existence, and how do they get bigger and bigger and bigger? And IC is one of those. That's just a QR code. If you're interested in the project, we won. So after that small grant, I applied to the ESRC, the Economic Social Research Council, which is a government. It's the government that department that gives money to business research, to social studies, social science, so forth, ESRC. And we won £630,000, which is quite incredible, really. I think it was the biggest ever grant that's been won in business history. And it was in internal comms, so that's really cool, right? And the internal comms community was delighted because it's recognition. It's like, yeah, what you do is important. This and with money, it's not just how much you get; it's where you get it from, right? How clean is your money, to some extent. You look at the LSE, the London School of Economics gets lots of money, but that's a lot of that is quite dirty money. From quite some dodgy organizations, they've even had to give some of that money back, heavens forbid, although not too much. I mean, they had to, remember Colonel Gaddafi? They used to educate his son, who gave them millions, and so it's all a bit of smelly money going around. But this is nice, clean money. This is from the government, and so I think the fact that we got money and we got so much of it to look at the internal comms profession and its history, I think it just tells you something, really. I think that was a huge boost for the profession. That's just a QR code. If you're interested, we create a lot of content, not just academically. The research project is about internal comms people. It's about their history. What we did last Tuesday was all about, most of the people in our conference were practitioners. Um, that code we have a podcast. We've got about 26, 27 episodes on it. We've got blogs, case studies, papers, everything. So I would, especially if you're doing your master's degree, I would recommend following us because there's quite a lot of nice stuff. So if you want, and we've got over 1,000 followers now. Isn't that incredible, right? We actually hit 1,000 during the conference, which I thought was lovely. So we got that there. So anyway, I'm just gonna probably won't have time to do all of this, but I'll try and do as much of this as possible. So where does it begin? Where does internal comms begin? In the beginning, and it, believe it or not. So that's an image of just some lonely building in a field. Believe it or not, that is Harrow Public School, right? That's one of the most famous schools in the world. Obviously, if you went to Harrow now, it would be much bigger than that. But at the time, it was basically that, and maybe a few a church, maybe a few other buildings. And believe it or not, and this would have been Harrow in the 1820s, 1830s. This is where we've kind of traced the origins of this internal communication too, which is bizarre. I mean, you never would have thought what it began in public schools, in these elite private schools. But yeah, the first organization that we've come across that actually had magazines were schools, right? They were schools, private schools. They started developing school magazines in the 1840s and 1850s. Oxford University has the first ever staff magazine in 1870. You may have heard that the Lowell Offering was the world's first magazine. That's a myth it goes around a lot of it. That is just not true. I don't know where that came from. The Lowell Offering. It's often said this was the world's first company magazine, probably the Americans, because it's from the States. And by the way, can I say very importantly now, internal communication is a British invention. It's something which started in the UK. Yes, we should be proud of that. What we do, what hundreds of thousands of people do around the world, millions of people maybe, started in this country. Yes. And so the Lowell Offering was actually, which I think was in Pennsylvania, was actually a community magazine. It wasn't a company magazine. An organizational company magazine is a magazine which is founded in a company for the employees of that company. Yes, that's what internal comms is. Yeah, if you've got somebody making a documentary about your organization or something in the newspaper, that's not internal comms. That's an external piece of media who's commenting on you. That's what the Lowell offering was. It was actually set up by a priest, a reverend, in a town, and in that town there was a big factory where lots of women. It was a textile factory, had lots of female employees, and a lot of the female employees published poetry and literature in this reference. That's not a company magazine, so I've got no idea how that managed to get into the IC um, kind of corpus. It's memory. Although, it's what would we call it today in AI? It's a phantom. Yeah. It's just something that's been created and to fill a gap, but it's not actually. But anyway, what happens in these schools? So these schools have a crisis, and lots of history is actually born out of crisis. If you look at the strategic role of AI, of IC, a lot of that is from a crisis, yeah, from COVID. Yes, these crises have an impact on lots of history is born out of the need to change things, to suddenly do something. And what happened was these schools for hundreds of years, they were founded in the 16th century. For hundreds of years, they only had the sons of the aristocracy. They were quiet institutes. They would probably get maybe 20 boys every year coming in. They'd be educated in classics, religion, and so forth, and that was it. And then, of course, at the end of the 18th century, what you have? You have the Industrial Revolution. And what new social class is born? Two social classes are born during the Industrial Revolution, the working class and the middle class. And what do middle class parents want? If you've got children, I expect we're all middle class here. What's the most important thing you want for your kids? Education. Yes? What's the two most important things? Three most important things that define the middle class: education, career, owning your own home. Yeah, those three are like they're the golden chalices of acceptability. And so suddenly these schools were flooded with new boys from the middle class, and their intake every year went from maybe 20 to the hundreds, and they were not designed for this. They weren't designed to be these institutions educating this new social class. And there was chaos as a result of this. Because don't forget, the boys lived in these schools. So the big problem was, how do you control the boys outside of teaching hours, right? And these boys terrorize their local areas. It's actually very, I mean, if you're interested in this, it's this book. It's called Mangan, Athleticism in the English Victorian Edwardian Public School. Do read that book. It's very, very funny. And so what happens is these boys terrorize their local area. Dogs and cats are attacked or killed, or um, Harrow at the time they were building the railway, the Northwestern Railway. Whenever you take a train from Euston to Manchester or Liverpool, the Northwest, that train was being built by Irish navvies. These Irish builders were built the same way as they built the canals they were building. That there were pitched battles, literally pitched battles between the boys of Harrow School and Irish builders. Right in Marylebone School, the headmaster was there was a revolution in the school. The headmaster was ejected. He was physically picked up and thrown out of the school. And so this is a crisis. And so how do you solve this crisis? And you solve it with sport. Okay, sport is brought into the school to give these boys something to do during their spare time, to burn off their all that energy they've got, to discipline them, to integrate them. And this man on the right is a very famous man called Thomas Arnold. Particularly if you're a rugby fan, you may have come across him. Thomas Arnold was the head of rugby school where they play rugby. Yes. And so he was at the forefront of this. There was a big revivalism in Christianity at this time. It was called muscular Christianity. It was all about being a man and being strong, onward Christian soldiers and all of this. And at the heart of this muscular Christianity was healthy living sport. And so they bring in sport into these institutions to try and discipline the boys. And guess what comes in as part of that sport? Magazines. Yes. Because if you have a sports club, if any of you are in a sports club, if any of you do anything, I don't know, yoga, judo, football, whatever, I'm sure you get an online newsletter, right? It'll be a newsletter saying, well, this is what we're doing. This is what we're playing. And that's what they did. You look at some of the first forms of internal communication in organizations, they were sports journals. Really interesting, right? And so now these sports magazines not only develop, we're doing sport, but they develop a concept of collective identity. Today, we'd call that organized corporate identity, organizational identity, who we are. What are our values? They develop organizational culture. This is who we are. This is what we stand for. This is what we believe in. At the time, they called it esprit de corps, the spirit of the body. And so they develop magazines. They start developing internal comms to integrate the boys into the school. And what's incredible is, let's just jump forward now to the 1880s, 1890s. We see the same thing happening in organizations. This is really interesting. By the way, this is what's called, and I forget how to. The problem is I don't know how to write on this thing, so I can't do it. If we were on Teams, I could do it, but don't worry, it's all good. Um, this is what's called, I can write this down later after the lecture. It's called institutional isomorphism, which is a very big posh word, which we use in organizational theory. It's actually from sociology, institutional isomorphism. So an institution is a social structure which controls what we think, what we do. They're templates. If you think about that, a profession is an institution, education, work, all of these are institutions. They're social structures which they provide sense and sense making. I mean, Liz gave a lovely um, quote from Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist, about man is an animal caught in the webs of his own meaning. That quote is actually not from Gates. It's actually originally from Max Weber. It's from Weber, and then Gates picks up on that. And Weber, who's a sociologist, is one of the big developers of institutional theory. Where do these social structures come from? They are made by us. Human beings create institutions, but then we pretend that they're objective, that they were created by nature, that they're normal. And often we forget we created them. It's like, oh no, but they've been around for millennia. No, they haven't. They were just invented, right? But you just forgot you did that, right? And so and then institutions get passed on and passed on and passed on. That's how things just, carry on. And what we're seeing here is the institutionalization of magazines, right? That magazines start colonizing spaces. They start off in schools, but within 50 years, they're everywhere. Yes, they're in workplaces, they're in charities, they're everywhere. Yeah? They start colonizing. They're in clubs, the Boy Scouts. They're there. They just start going. They're in associational life. And to isomorph means to take on the same form. Remember school? Remember when you did geometry? Isosceles triangles. So iso meaning same and morph meaning shape. So to isomorph means to take the same shape of an institution. To copy, literally, it's a posh word for to copy. You're just copying stuff from other. But what's interesting, what we know is that institutional isomorphism actually takes place in society. So what do organizations need? What do they crave for? They crave for recognition, legitimacy, respect, right? This is very important. If you lose your reputation, you're dead. Yes, nobody wants to talk to you. And so um, what what we know about institutions is that they actually begin in society. So society starts doing stuff, which it says this is correct and this is appropriate and this is what we should be doing. And then organizations, because they want to be legitimate, they want to be respected, they absorb institutions from society and start copying it to do it. So, and that makes them. Now we can think about a load of things here. Think about things like EDI. Yes. Organizations now say, well, and they get audited. They talk about this. It's in their mission statements. Did organizations invent EDI? Did they? The EDI, I'm sure, is part of a lot of your internal comms, correct? Yeah. Did organizations invent EDI? No, of course they didn't. It came from society. Organizations absorbed EDI. You look at organizations 50 years ago, they were terrible places which discriminated against homosexuals and Jews and black people. Did any of you ever watch the TV series HBO Succession? Really, really good TV. And there's a great line out. It's based on the Murdochs. There's a lot of good organization, and um, there's a lovely line where he says, what did my father used to say? No Jews, no blacks, no women above the fourth floor. Yeah. And that's what organizations were like 50. They were not particularly. You do know, don't you, that organizations and up until the 1960s and 70s had marriage bars. Yeah. So if you were a woman and you worked for a big company like Shell or NatWest or whatever, as soon as you got married, you had to give up your job, right? Or if you had a baby. But when you got married, you had a baby anyway, so it didn't matter, right? So, you know, um, so so things that we do know, think about things like environmentalism, recycling. Did organizations invent recycling? No, they didn't. It came from society, and then it got absorbed into in order to make them legitimate. And of course, organizations get into trouble with things like greenwashing and whitewashing and pinkwashing and blah blah blah. But don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of organizations. I think organizations are cool. It's just, they're they're not the I don't know, the virtuous things we think they are sometimes, but they are. So why did these organizations start copying the schools? Because they have the same problems. So these organizations start in this, they have growing pains. So in the same way as schools grew quickly in the 1830s, organizations started growing very quickly at the end of the 19th century. You see the rise of what we call today the corporation, right? So before that, organizations were little. There was a few people working in them, not many. Even these big Victorian factories only employed a few hundred people at the most. What you start seeing at the end of the 19th century is organizations employing thousands of people, tens of thousands of people. The post office employed 200,000 people that had never been seen before. Railway companies, the Great Western Railway employed 60,000 people. Huge monstrous, and they had the same problem that they couldn't control these workers, that they needed to. And so, because many of their managers were from the public schools, they started bringing in the institutions from that school to that. So they started introducing things like sport, what we see here, and they introduced magazines. Now, what you see on the left here is really, really, really important. If you are an internal comms person, that is the world's first ever company magazine that we found, right? So that is the Ibis magazine from the Prudential Insurance Company, and that is 1878. And as far as we know, that's the oldest company magazine we've ever found, right? It's interesting. I spoke to John Clegg and his team of people of Oxford. They were saying, "Oh, but it is interesting." He said, "Well, actually, Oxford University set up a staff magazine in 1870 and actually set up articles. There's a constitution saying this magazine is part of you." So that's interesting. So that's an earlier organizational magazine, and that I would say the Ibis is your first company magazine. So, and then they started growing very quickly. They start growing very quickly. This is not definitive, by the way. This is just a sample of magazines. But notice that these are all big. These are not being set up by little organisations, the Post Office, Lever Brothers, Unilever, the London County Council, the Shell Transport, the London and County Bank, which becomes the NatWest. These are big corporations which suddenly start producing these magazines. And by the way, going back to this very quickly, how do we know that those magazines were based on the school magazines? Because what we did, and you could, I think I sent Liz the articles. We did content analysis. we got two company magazines and we got two school magazines, and we mapped them onto each other, and they mapped on perfectly. Yeah. We looked at their content, and they were more or less the same. Now, because the school magazines are older than the company magazines, we were able to conclude that the company magazines were copying the school magazines. Does that make sense? Because one came before the other one. So that was some kind of hard evidence that we did to prove that argument. Um, why did these magazines start growing so quickly? Because we see the rise of this thing, the large scale corporation. That's Holborn Bar's the headquarters potential. So as I said, at the end of the 19th century, suddenly you get these organizations employing thousands, tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people. And what's important about them is they start integrating. That's why they become so big. So they integrate production with distribution with marketing. They create national markets. Before this, there were no national markets. National mar that they actually appear because of revolutions in transport. So in the 19th century, you have a railway network established, right? If you wanted to get from London to Liverpool, in 1800, it would take days. You couldn't sell stuff there. When you've got trains, you had canals and trains, you have telegraphs where you can communicate, and then telephones. You start creating national markets, right? And then suddenly you start seeing these huge organizations that grow in size to try to meet these national markets, right? Um, but they have a big problem with staff. They can control production, they can control distribution, they can control marketing, but you can't control people. And the problem is to set up these organizations, the capital investment ran into millions. It was most only a few companies could do that. I mean, if you look at the railways, you actually had to have acts of parliament to set up railways. They were just that big, right? They were brought in by legislation to calm investors. Um, and the big problem that these organizations faced in Britain and in the United States was that workers were going on strike a lot, or they were just leaving. You couldn't control your workers, right? They weren't integrated into your company, right? And the problem is if you're trying to set up a national market and you're integrating production with supply. So, just to give you a good example of that, a lot of these companies actually went backwards. So, if you look at railway companies, a lot of railway companies actually started going into coal mining and steel. So they would go backwards, and then they would make trains, and then they would build hotels. These were huge organizations. Yes. But the problem was, if your workers went on strike, or even if the workers went on strike in one part of it would shut down the whole organization, which would then shut down your markets, and then your investments were screwed, right? And so this was a huge problem. And by the way, this is very important. During this period, personnel management didn't exist. There was no HRM or personnel management. So how do you and there were very few managers, right? So this is even more. This is a nightmare for these organizations, right? And what this is the backdrop of internal comms. We need to communicate with workers, so they start bringing. So what they do is they develop this new practice, this new institution to solve this problem of workers, and they're called internal labor markets. And you cannot separate the growth of internal comms from the growth of internal labor markets. One produced the other. So, what do I mean by internal labor markets? So, what you've got to understand is the traditional system of employing people, which had been going on for hundreds of years, were external labor markets, right? So, you just hired someone, but you didn't train that person. That person was usually trained by a guild. They worked for an external organization, and you employed them on an ad hoc basis. You employed them, they worked, and then they left. You built a ship and they left, right? If there was no work for textiles in the summer, you didn't employ them anymore. So work was short term, it was minimal. There was very little relationships between you and your employees. Workers were treated like commodities. You bought them and sold them when you needed them. And what happened was these big corporations, they begin to introduce markets where your employees stay with you for life. All right, these are internal labor markets, right? They are given a job for life, and then you start seeing. So this is absolutely fascinating. I think this is fascinating. Two new words appear at the end of the 19th century. Two new words, and those two words are career and employee. Yeah, they're brand new words that hadn't, and both of those words are because of internal labor markets, right? So the first time we see the word employee spelt in the French way, by the way, because it's a French word, was employé de chemin de fer, right? Someone who is employed by a railway company, and that word gradually got bigger and bigger. So being an employee meant you worked for a company for life. You had a career, so you had a career structure, you had benefits, you had stability. Yes, this is what's really important here, and career being the same. You actually had a career now, and one key strategy of those internal labor markets was what became known as industrial welfare. So things like sickness benefits, unemployment benefits, disability benefits, pensions, education, right? This was welfare. And many of those welfare was tenure linked. So the whole reason why you're developing this is to keep people in the company. You want to keep them in the company to keep the company ticking over. So pensions are a good. You know that the longer you're in a company, the bigger your pension. Leave the company, you might lose your pension, right? So benefits were designed, and then you get company magazines as part of this. And guess what? A big component was of the company magazine: births, marriages, and deaths. There was just there everywhere. You know, promotions. It was all about creating this culture of we are a family. We are a family. Look at that image. It's there. Yeah. And we all belong. Guess what? Those kids are also going to work in boots, right? We found this. It was incredible. When we were doing research, we were finding you had like three generations of people working in the same company. So they were just, so the workers were physically producing new workers. Yes, which were then going into. And by the way, these company magazines were read by families as well. You often found women's pages in them, children's pages. Yeah? Really, really beautiful. Yeah? This sense of community that they were trying to develop. So, so that's the origins of these. And this man in particular, John Commons, who was an American economist, lawyer, institutional theorist, he actually wrote a book called Industrial Goodwill in 1919, very important book. And in that book, he said there are three types of labor markets. And he differentiated between, or three types of employment systems, not labor markets, employment systems, because they didn't use the word. And he called them the commodity model, the machinery model, and the goodwill model. So the commodity model is you just treat your workers like crap. You buy them and sell them. That's the external model. You don't look after them. The machinery model was based on a guy called Frederick Taylor, who invented scientific management. This was an idea you just treat your workers like they are an extension of your machines. This is mass production. But the goodwill model is the idea that you treat your workers like people. You have partnerships with them. You develop goodwill in them. You look after them. And internal costs. And they kept using words like esprit de corps, goodwill to underlay this modern management partnership structure. And if you look at internal comms, you will see the word esprit de corps and goodwill being used all the time. Yeah. Today we use words like employee engagement, employee well-being. Yes. I'm sure you use that in your comms a lot, right? They were using the same language 100 years ago. They just used different words for it. Yeah. And in the UK, because obviously he's from the States. Although it's interesting, and I know it happens now, but even then, we were seeing a lot of transfer of knowledge. So Brits were going to America to find out what was going on. Cadbury went to America to find out how they were doing company magazines, and Americans were coming over here looking at there was all of this knowledge transfer going on, which still goes on, which I think was really interesting. Yeah, and here we see this couple here. or the Webbs, Sydney and Beatrice Webb. They were like this power couple of a progressive power couple. They set up the London School of Economics. They were the founders of the LSE. These people were founders of the Labour Party, the Fabian Society. These were just really, these are your progressive couple. And they wrote a book in 1888 called, in what was it called? Industrial Society. No, Industrial Democracy. Industrial democracy. The idea that employees had to be brought in, they had to be given rights. There had to be, to stop all of these strikes and violence. That employees had to be part of the dynamic of this new capitalist society. And the other guy, if you like chocolate, then he's important. If you like Kit Kat, he invented that. That's Seaborn Rowntree. He was the owner of the chocolate company Rowntree, and he, by the way, was the founder of the Worker Welfare Society. Today, that's called the CIPD, the Chartered Institute of Personal Development, the biggest HRM association in the world. He was the founder of that. Yeah. And so Rowntree, who was a Quaker, his religion said you had to treat people with respect. This was all God's creation. Um, he was fundamental for introducing things like, welfare magazines, all that. So there's this that you're beginning to see a change in the way we're thinking about work and employment, and that groundswell is where your internal comms is coming from. And there you go. So these magazines integrated workers into companies, they provided information, education, training, they created organization identity and culture through concepts such as esprit de corps, goodwill, and they were vital, as I've said, for internal labor markets and also for partnerships. So what you start seeing at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, is a lot of leading corporations set up partnership schemes where employees were given shares in companies. They set up workers' councils. They gave workers power over certain things. And today, which is the most famous organization in Britain which still has a partnership? Can anyone tell me? It's very fair. I'll give you a clue. Retail. Retail. Which one? You can say
John
or you can
Lewis.
John Lewis. And that is and guess what John Lewis set up? They set up Company Magazine. Yes, as part, because if you have a partnership, you have to communicate with your employees. Yes. So look, this is incredible. What you see in front of you is the first page of the articles of the partnership of John Lewis, which still exists today, written in 1928. And look at what the first article is. The first article, not the 10th or the 20th or the 100th, the first. The partnership shall maintain at least one journal or news sheet, hereafter called the Gazette. It shall exist to serve the partnership both as an instrument of commercial efficiency and social reform, and to provide a sufficient means of communication between all partners upon their concerns as partners. There shall be at least 12 issues per year. That is institutionalization of internal communication, which still exists today. That's incredible. And also look at the narrative, look at the discourse. The magazine is about commercial efficiency and social welfare. It's about making money and being decent to people. Do you see that? We still see that narrative today. Internal comms is strategic and important to the bottom line of the organization, but it's also a key component of our social responsibility. Yes? Are we familiar with that narrative? Yeah? Or what we call discourse, historical discourses, which keep repeating themselves from generation to the next, right? So we can see that there. And then they institutionalized even further. In 1918, the Industrial Welfare Society was established. They started giving training courses on company magazines. They promoted them. They even started holding conferences. So when you go to the next practitioner conference you go to, you should sit down and think this has been done for over 100 years. 100 years ago, there were people like you sitting in conferences of works editors for company magazines established by the Industrial Welfare. So we start seeing these professional editor conferences. I think 1928 was the first one, right? And then, of course, in 1949, the British Association of Industrial Editors is established, which today is the Institute of Internal Comms, which is a major reason why you're doing this master's degree. Yeah, it goes back to this professionalization of the association. So being aware of time, I'm going to zoom very, very quickly forward. I'm literally going to close this up in about 5, 10 minutes. So these magazines explode, especially after the war. From about 350 magazines in 1938, there's 1,500 of them in 1961. In 1965, their readership is 17 million people. That's unbelievable. That's 1.5 million more than the national press, right? I mean, that just gives you an idea of the sizes. But then in the 60s, the magazines, they lose their power. They suddenly they go from being objects of virtue, of objects of criticism and ridicule. And it's because of this huge change. It's the 60s brings in several things, the end of a deferential society, doffing your cap. You can't do that anymore, right? And you can't talk down to people. Magazines were about written talk. You couldn't talk back with a magazine. And also, the 60s was an age of affluence, the affluent workers. These workers were educated, they were rich, they were fully employed. They weren't going to be spoken down to anymore, right? And also, they start going on strike a hell of a lot. So there's this sense of crisis. Again, how are we integrating people back into our organization? And we actually see this there. I actually can't see that because I've got your screen sharing, but actually, go back. Actually, if I do that, there you go. The aura of Victorian. This, by the way, is a memo from the Midland Bank, HSBC, from the 70s. The aura of Victorian paternalism, which banking formerly exuded, is today regarded as offensive by our staff. It's offensive. This kind of being nice and welfare now. It just doesn't work. The pattern of authority in industry, including banking, has changed considerably. Hang on, let me just bring this back up. The staff have become more powerful economically. They're now generally well educated, despite comments to the contrary. They're well organized. They're capable of sharing the responsibility of running the banking industry. To involve each and every member of staff in the functional group is important and will become increasingly more so. If this sharing of responsibility is to be achieved, however, there must be a greater communication of the objectives of the group. We are beginning to see the emergence of internal communication, right? It's coming from this. So the 60s undermines company magazines. Um, uh, as I've said, from more educated people, the rise of a permissive society, the baby boomers, drug, sex, rock and roll, all of this, but also massive strikes that were going on. And a key thing here is John Welfare Society. In 1965, he changes the name of the Industrial Welfare Society to the Industrial Society. That's not just a change of name. That is really important. He's taking welfare because Garnett said that welfare was a major cause of Britain's problems. That what used to be the cure is now the poison, right? It worked well in the Victorian or into war. It doesn't work anymore. And in his book, The Work Challenge, he said work was meaningless to people. Workers weren't involved. Um, that work wasn't rewarding. So of course they were going on strike or not coming in. And he said that workers had to they had to be respected by their employees, they had to be integrated, and they had to be communicated to. And Garnet actually invents the briefing group, which today we call team meetings. So he's actually saying, look, we need to stop writing, we need to start talking, we need to start having, meetings with our staff. We need to stop it. And this we still should write, but the writing should be supporting the speaking, not the other way around. And this communication should be two-way communication. This was a revolutionary idea. We're beginning to see the concept, and of course they start attacking magazines. I mean, this is lovely. This is from the Industrial Welfare Society, an organization that used to say you must have a magazine is now saying, actually, guys, these magazines aren't as good as we once thought they were. Look at that lovely. I mean, that's, to be fair, it's from the Evening Standard, but it's a lovely little cartoon which was in the Industrial Welfare Society. Look, so the House Journal triumphs again. I've just received my thrill-packed summer number, 6 action cram pages of dynamite, and look what's in the magazine. Plant Those Seeds Again by Percy Middleton of Accounts, The Case of Your Budgery God by J.H.H. Costing, and last but not least, our friends, the Tea Ladies. they look, they're taking the piss out of magazines, right? They're saying, look, these things aren't. But they do actually say we should have magazines, but these are magazines that should have an editorial. They should be independent and so forth. And um, so what Garnett does is he undermines the old form of communication in order to bring in a new form, which is internal communication. There you go. The manager's responsible. And what he argues is that managers have a fundamental responsibility to communicate, which they hadn't been doing earlier. Yeah. So the word internal comms first begins to emerge in British business in the 60s. The oldest reference we found is 1959 in the BBC. 59 is the oldest, but it's in the 60s you really start seeing it being used in the 70s, both in the UK and the US. Very different from the old form of editorial comms. It was two-way, it was management, it was spoken, it was based on channels, different channels, CCTV, magazines, councils, briefing groups, video, film, and it got integrated and targeted. It was much more scientific, much more dynamic, and it liked technology. It used technology a lot, right? That was the other big thing with this. And the briefing group was a big part of that. It was also supported by legislation. Uh, what you must understand, this is very important, is before 1971, managers and businesses were under no legal obligation to talk to workers. There was no legal need to communicate before 1971. And then in 1971, the Industrial Relations Act was passed amid these huge strikes. I mean, obviously, we're all too young here, relatively. Though Liz will remember some of this. I remember the 3 day week. Although maybe you're probably a child then, but the strikes of the 78, the winter of discontent. I remember the winter of discontent when in 1979 there was no electricity. I mean, forget strikes now again on a tube. This was awful, right? There was rubbish everywhere. There were national strikes. The dead were not being buried in 78 and 79. And this is a crisis, right? And so the government suddenly says, guys, you need to start communicating. And they passed the 1971 Industrial Relations Act, the Bullet Report saying you need to have, communication with representatives, the 1982 Employment Act under Thatcher, which actually says you need to communicate and you will be audited by inspectors, which will come to your companies to check that you are communicating. Right? So this is the beginning of communication audit reports in 82. And of course, the McLeod report, 2009. And by the way, this is a 1982 document. Look at this. This is talking about how we need to communicate. Because of this 1982 Employment Act, there are four elements to this process: giving information of areas of concern to employees, consulting employees to find out their views on matters that will affect them, encouraging involvement of employees in company performance, and raising awareness of employees' environmental factors affecting their jobs. They're still the aims that we have in IC today, are they not? Yeah. And this was, 1982. And also we have a change in management philosophy, management by objectives by Drucker. That became the management philosophy, the 50s, 60s, 70s. Organizations had to develop strategic objectives and communicate them to their employees. And even teams of workers, departments had to have objectives and they had to be communicated. This is the beginning of yearly annual reviews of employees, where you set up. So not only did the organization have objectives and teams have objectives, but employees had objectives, which had to be clearly communicated. So this change in philosophy leads to this emergence of internal comms. Now I'm going to finish there. The 80s, obviously, with Thatcher, these big corporations start becoming much more consumer focused. A lot of state industries get privatized. So now it's all about marketing. I call this marketing internal comms, right? You have things like these things used to be called sheep dipping. She talked to Mark, right? They used to organize these where you'd get thousands of workers and turn them into consumer focused employees, the challenge of choice. And they used to call it sheep dipping, where you'd be dipping your employees into Thatcherite custom. What do we call it today, by the way? Employee transformation. It used to be called sheep dipping, right? And that was, of course, the big 80s and 90s. Of course, I'm sure Liz, again, you'll remember this. all about organizational culture. Everyone was going on about, shine and so forth. Peters and Waterman that Peter and Waterman in Search of Excellence in the 1980s, which was the Bible of organizational culture. Look at the wiki site for In Search of Excellence. It was the most read book of the 1980s. It was even more widely read in America than the Bible, right? There was and it was all about change. Strong cultures mean strong organizations, and that needs communication and being employee. But it was all now about making your employees very different. And then by the 2000s, communication changed again. The old command and control, top-down communication, the cascade. No, it was now about conversations with employees, treating employees as human resources that you would co-create with using these new wonderful digital platforms was the idea here. And of course, that was led by changes in management philosophy. So what I'm saying is that changes in IC are often produced by changes in the environment and changes in management thinking. And here we have this. If you haven't read it, you need to read it. You need to read that. It's Kahn's 1990 classic article on employee engagement. Engaged workers are what you should be doing as an organization, as managers. And at the heart of that engagement is communication, which was borne out by the Engage for Success 2009. And then very quickly, finally, obviously, what brought this, a tragic way to do it, but history is driven by tragedy. You know what Marx said? He says history repeats itself. The first time round, what did he say? The first time round is tragedy, and the second time round is farce. Yeah? And tragedy does drive, crises drive a lot of that history. COVID made COVID put internal comms at the strategic table because you suddenly, how do you communicate with your workers, right? And here we have a government report with the Institute of Internal Comms is Jan there, and that's there and the future. All right, that's me finished. Now I'm afraid I've got to run off and get a train. But let me how do I stop this? Stop the share.
Well done.
I
Well,
hope you found that interesting.
can I just say, Michael, thank you so much. I mean, it's so interesting just seeing the way in which internal communication is so intertwined with issues in society, with issues
Yes,
in
yes,
organizations. And I think for me, sort of what it does is just demonstrate, well, the value that internal communication has added right back from those days in the public schools where
Oh,
it's being
you,
used to help, manage
yeah,
difficult situations
yeah,
right
yeah,
up to the way in which we're using it today. But
yeah.
I know you have a train to
No,
catch.
no, no. So, but I'll just quickly respond to that, and I'll go absolutely. And do you know what though? I'd go even further than what you said, right? Even though what you said is correct, is that I those organisations wouldn't have been possible without internal communication,
Yeah,
if that makes sense. That it wasn't like they added value. That would suggest, but they could have existed anyway. IC's kind of sprinkling on a bit of the good stuff. No, the argument I'm making, which came out of my research, was I used to think that they were just, and the more I researched, the more I realised, no, 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 no. It's literally that they're creating the organisation. You
wow.
know that how can an organization? I'll go with just one last thing, and then I'll go one last pearl of wisdom from history. Where does the word company come from? Right? It's a new word. It's like employee. It's like career. Right? What is the etymological root of company? What words come from? Shakespeare didn't talk about the company of Venice or the employee or the manager. He spoke about the merchant of Venice, right? And so companies only start emerging in the 17th and 18th century, where 16th century, to be said, 16th century in Italy originally, where merchants started pooling wealth together and then started coming up with legal systems of sharing risk and wealth. Company is from two words, the Spanish word comer, which means to eat, and pan, which means bread. So company means to eat bread. Uh, Let us eat bread. And what that tells me is that organizations are as much social and cultural entities as they are economic and business
Yeah.
entities. I think that idea, they are both. They're not one or the other. They are both.
Mm. Mm.
And at the heart of both of those institutional logics, the normative and the instrumental, is communication. Yeah, I think it's absolutely fundamental.
Brilliant.
Right, I've got to go, but thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. If you've got questions, you can email me. You can just send me some, and then I can get back with that. But thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah. And thank you. And let's thank Michael in the traditional way.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
so much. And I jolly well hope that you catch your train as
I
well.
will I will catch my train, and I'll come again, and the next time we'll have more time. All right, bye bye.
Fantastic.
See you later.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Hang on, let me. I think.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michael. That was
Thank
absolutely
you.
brilliant.
Cheers,
Yeah,
cheers.
It was
just
great.
there's
Bye-bye.
so
Thank you.
so much interesting stuff in that.
Thank you. I'm glad you found it interesting. Right. See you later, guys. Yeah. Bye.
Yeah,
Bye, Michael.
bye. Thanks ever so much. Oops,
No,
hang
no
on,
problem.
hang on, hang on. I'm going to stop recording.